Hi, I'm Will Miles with ReadingReaction.com. Well, the committee released the college football playoff top 25 tonight, and since Florida's in the running for the championship, I thought it was worth going over the scenarios. So here are the rankings. Alabama, number one, not a huge surprise. Notre Dame, number two, again, the win over Clemson. Clemson, number three, a little bit of a surprise. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Ohio State, number four. Texas A&M, number five, since they beat Florida. Florida ranked number six. Cincinnati, number seven, and Northwestern, number eight. So the things I wanted to think about here: Georgia, not in the top eight, with virtually no shot at making it into a playoff. Who would have thought about that at the beginning of the year? Cincinnati's going to get a shot before Georgia would, even in the unlikely event that Georgia's able to pull out an SEC championship win, which would require Florida losing a couple of times and then also Georgia beating Alabama. Texas A&M at number five. This is where they deserve to be. Their only losses to Alabama. They beat Florida. So a top 10 win, a loss to the number one overall team. This makes sense. Clemson at number three. This indicates the committee is not holding the Notre Dame loss against the Tigers since Trevor Lawrence was out with COVID. And it'll be interesting to see what the committee does if Notre Dame loses closely to the Tigers in the ACC championship game. Ohio State at number four. Paper thin schedule. So this is based purely on reputation. Put it this way: when you're holding off Indiana at the end of a home game, even given Indiana being pretty good this year, that's an issue. But the Buckeyes only have Illinois, Michigan State, and Michigan left on the schedule. So they should waltz into the playoff. It should be easy, no problem at all. Cincinnati at number seven. And this is the problem with conference only play for the Bearcats. They just haven't really played anybody. They narrowly beat UCF 36-33, though that wasn't really as close as that final score. But, Army's an okay team. SMU's an okay team, but that isn't an SEC schedule. And I think if the committee was truly grading on accomplishment, they might think about putting Cincinnati ahead of Ohio State. But the reality is that everybody knows and understands that Ohio State's a better team. And that's the same thing with having BYU at 14. I actually laud the Cougars for playing a full schedule when the Pac-12 and the Mountain West decided to call it quits earlier this year, but then reinstitute later on in the year. But the reality is that BYU really needed to schedule that game with Washington if they were going to get any respect. The fact that they haven't been able to get that on the schedule, irrespective of why, I think that just really precludes them from getting the respect that they're going to need, even though they have a very effective offense and just blew the doors off of Boise State. Alabama's number one. No surprise. The Tide have the nation's best offense. They beat Texas A&M. They have a Heisman candidate quarterback. The SEC is the best conference in America, and as of right now, Alabama is the best team in that conference. Now, certainly the Tide looks like they've had some issues on the defensive side of the ball, though beating Kentucky 63-3 this past weekend, I think sort of at least says some of those things might be in the background. So that brings us to Florida at number six. Texas A&M at five. I know some people might be concerned about that. Don't be. Just win. The reality is that you'll end up with a three-way tie essentially between Alabama, Texas A&M, and Florida. The fact that Alabama has already beaten Texas A&M means that if Florida can beat Alabama, you can't necessarily say one team is better than the other. It just so happens that Florida lost on the road on a last-second field goal after a fumble. Texas A&M was beaten handily by Alabama, and so if Florida is able to handle Alabama, I think you get in. Same thing with Alabama. Don't worry. Just win. If you beat the number one team in the country for the SEC championship, you get into the championship game or get into the playoff. And then Ohio State, Clemson, and Notre Dame. It will be a little bit interesting to see how this plays out. If Notre Dame wins again in the ACC championship game, then Clemson probably falls out. If Clemson wins, then Notre Dame probably falls out. However, if that game is close and say Notre Dame loses a close one to Clemson, you might see two teams from the ACC get in, which will be interesting because usually it's people complaining about the SEC. The reality is that Florida's loss to Texas A&M doesn't really amount to very much in the grand scheme of things. That slip up will not keep a one-loss SEC champion out of the playoff. What it does do is mean there's zero margin for error against Kentucky, Tennessee, or LSU. It also means that the Gators have to beat Alabama and Atlanta. Perhaps, I don't really think this is true, but perhaps Florida could have snuck in had they gone to Atlanta undefeated and lost a close game to Alabama. But that opportunity is gone now. It's now win and you're in. At the beginning of the year, though, if you'd have told Gators fans that they'd lose to Texas A&M after a late fumble set up the Aggies for a game-winning field goal, suffer a COVID outbreak that eliminated the team's bye week, have to face Felipe Franks coming back to the swamp after coming back from a 14-0 first quarter deficit to Georgia. And all they had to do on November 25th was win against Kentucky, Tennessee, and a down LSU squad. You really would have taken that. And that's the situation for the Gators. They don't have to worry about anybody in front of them. It sounds kind of Raidersy, but the mantra for Florida moving forward doesn't have anything to do with style points or Heisman trophies. It doesn't matter whether they win by 35 points, whether they win by 14 points, or whether they win by 1 point. Just win, baby. That's all it is. Florida wins out, they make it to the playoff.
If you like these videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Or you can follow me at WillMilesSEC on Twitter or at Facebook.com/readandreaction. Until next time, be a smarter fan.